Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. The Biden administration announced there is now a federal law that designates lynching as a federal hate crime. The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act comes decades and nearly a century after failed attempts to outlaw lynching. Public historian and author Michelle Duster joins me to discuss the passage of this long overdue bill. Michelle, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me, Kevin.
So President Joe Biden signed a bill into law that makes lynching a federal hate crime. What were your initial thoughts on this when you heard the news that this could be happening?
I felt a sense of relief. This has been a long time coming, over 124 years since my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, visited the White House to talk with President William S. McKinley about enacting this legislation. So finally, several generations, it's become a reality.
Now, I feel like this is a very well-known story, but for those who don't know, can you tell us about the history of Emmett Till and why this is actually so significant?
Well, when Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who visited Mississippi from Chicago in 1955, and he was accused of whistling to a white woman, and her husband and a couple of other people kidnapped him and tortured him, killed him, and threw him into the river. And so this was an egregious act of violence against a child. And his mother, Aunt Minnie Till Mobley, held an open casket funeral so the whole world would be able to see how people treat African Americans. And it made an impact because he was so young and accused of such I don't know when whistling is a crime. So it just really made an impact.
Now, as you mentioned, this occurred in 1955, and I feel like the older I get, the more it doesn't feel like it's that long ago, but it was quite some time ago. Why do you think we're now seeing a federal response to this?
Well, we're seeing a federal response to making lynching a hate crime. The bill was named after Emmett Till, but lynching has been a part of our country's history ever since the Civil War. So we've had over 160 years of this violence, this mob rule that was prevalent from the end of the Civil War until maybe the 1930s or 40s. But there still have been lynchings since then, because the definition of lynching is murder at the hands of a mob. And so extrajudicial killing. And one could argue that Ahmaud Arbery's murder was a lynching.
Now, you were actually there to see the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act get put into place. And as you mentioned, over 100 years ago, your great-grandmother and historical figure Ida B. Wells visited the White House in an attempt to enact an anti-lynching legislation. What was it like to see this in person and actually be there to kind of witness history?
It was an honor to actually have the opportunity to literally witness history real time. It made it real. And I felt a sense of relief, as I'm sure many people did, to make this into law. And what it does is it makes lynching categorized as a hate crime, which makes it, for it to be federal law, that means that federal investigations would be done of this type of crime versus leaving it to local and state officials.
Now, I must admit, I think it's a little disappointing to learn that Congress had tried and failed more than 200 times to outlaw lynching. What message do you think this sends to our country?
Well, it takes a while to have legislation passed and to have crimes that have been committed against, that pretty much have been racially based crimes that traditionally and historically were committed against mostly African Americans. And many times they were committed by people who were part of the law. So they were the sheriff, they were the judge, they were the attorneys. And so it's hard to get justice when the people who are supposed to be protecting you are committing the crimes. So by this becoming law, it will take the investigation out of the local situation and to a federal investigation.
I'm really grateful that you actually mentioned that because I don't think a lot of people understand that. Like you mentioned, that the people who were doing this were a part of the law. So I thought that was like really brilliant that you added that. Now, according to NPR, the maximum sentence for a perpetrator convicted under the Anti-Lynching Act is 30 years when conspiracy to commit a hate crime results in death or serious bodily injury. Do you think this is fair considering the crime?
Well, I think what's significant about that particular part of the law is the fact that a person can be convicted for lynching, hate crime, if they conspire to commit a lynching. And that makes it even more extensive. And so for that, I mean, I think that is fair. If you conspire to lynch somebody, that you can be tried and convicted for 30 years.
Now, although lynching is commonly associated with slavery and the Jim Crow era, our country has seen the lynching of African Americans as recent as 2019. In a time where it feels like white supremacy and white nationalists have a resurgence, do you have faith that this will make an impactful change in our country?
Well, the difference between before this lynching act was passed and now is basically the law. You can't legislate morality, but you can legislate the law. And so this would be in effect if somebody does commit the crime, then how they would be punished and how the crime would be investigated is what's the difference with this law.
Now, over the past few years, we finally addressed some of the terrors many African Americans face on a national scale. And I believe that we've thought critically about the African American experience, probably more so than we have publicly in years prior. What do you think contributed to that?
Well, I think it's just, Black people have been in this country for 400 years, and it's really time for us to have the same level of protection as anybody else in this country. And so this legislation does provide that level of protection against a crime that has been primarily inflicted on the African American community. It was a form of domestic terrorism, and it's important to have laws against this type of mob rule that was prevalent during my great grandmother Ivy Wells's time.
Now, I want to add that what do you think social media has played a part in the education of learning about Black history? Do you think it's made a huge difference, or do you think there's something else that has kind of educated or got more people to be interested in learning about Black American history?
Well, I think there's two things going on in our country right now. I mean, one is, this push to make sure that people are educated about our history and are able to celebrate those even who are lesser known heroes in our history. But then there's also an effort to make sure that this history is not taught. And so I think sometimes the more resistance there is to teaching and learning about it, the more resistance there is to teaching about it. So you have these sort of counter efforts going on at the same time.
Now, you've been working for over 30 years, so I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the work you've done in regards to racial and gender equity. Your services have led to major changes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I'm based in Chicago, and I was involved in having a national monument created in honor of my great grandmother, Ida B. Wells. I was involved in having a major street renamed after her, historical marker, an honorary street, and then most recently a suffrage mural, which includes 10 women, including my great grandmother. And then nationally, I have been involved in a couple of other monuments that are to suffragists, as well as I just came from a street renaming ceremony in Memphis. So the city of Memphis is starting to recognize my great grandmother in public history projects as well. There are also markers that are being placed around the country in honor of victims of lynching. It's important for us to remember their names and to remember their humanity. So there are multiple projects, as well as I've written several books, including Ida B. the Queen and Ida B. Wells' Voice of Truth.
Now, can you actually tell us a little bit more about your great grandmother? I think a lot of people know about her, but for those who don't know, can you tell us more about just the impact she's had on Black American history?
Right. Well, my great grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was born enslaved in 1862, Holly Springs, Mississippi. And she went on to become a pioneering data journalist, investigative journalist, a civil rights activist, a suffragist. She was one of the co-founders of the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And so she was involved in many situations or many initiatives to basically fight for first-class citizenship for African Americans and women.
All right, thank you so much. And before I let you go, I just want to get your opinions on this. I know that recently there have been a lot of movies about Black American history. And I just want to get your thoughts as somebody who works so well within that field. Do you think that these movies are necessary, or do you think there should be another way to educate the public on Black American history?
I think every way that is possible to educate people is important. There's nothing wrong with having multiple mediums that tell the same information. In fact, Mattel just created an Ida B. Wells doll for their Inspiring Women series, and so that's yet another way that people can learn about history, learn about my great grandmother and several other people who are included in that series. So all of it matters, dolls, books, movies, public history projects as far as monuments and markers and murals, cartoons. I mean, whatever we can do to get this information out for every age level.
All right, Michelle, thank you so much. Before you go, can you just let everybody know how they can keep in touch with you?
The easiest way is I'm at Michelle Duster on Facebook and Instagram, and on Facebook at MLD Writes, WRITES.
All right, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Kibin.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.